All right, I think we have enough people to kick things off now. All righty. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 11th installment of a public initiative hosted by the U.S. Asia Institute, Southeast Asian Focus. For those who have attended our events in the past, welcome back. And for those who are new to USAI, thanks for joining us. My name is Alec Bowman. I'm the Director of Programs Communications here at the U.S. Asia Institute. And for a bit of brief background, USAI is a nonpartisan, United Nations recognized nonprofit with a 43-year track record of building understanding between the peoples and governments of the United States and Asia. This specific series will provide unique opportunities for the public to engage in issues of importance to the region of Southeast Asia, as Southeast Asia continues to be a region of economic, strategic, and political importance, gaining a deeper understanding of the challenges and opportunities the region faces, and areas for further U.S. engagement is paramount. Southeast Asian Focus targets congressional staff, U.S. executive branch officials, foreign diplomats, and members of the policy and business communities. And this briefing will provide an overview of the challenges climate change poses to diplomacy, food security, and the environment in the region. Now, I'd like to get the briefing started with just a couple housekeeping notes. First, I'd like to give a special thanks for the support of USAI's corporate stakeholders for making this program possible. And that goes out to the Sands, AIG, ConocoPhillips, FedEx, Walmart, Philip Morris International, and Fairfield Maxwell. And I'd also like to note that during the last 15 minutes or so of the briefing, there will be time for questions from the audience. So if you have a question that you would like our speakers to address, please type in the Q&A function at any time, or you can directly message me if you prefer, and I can pass it along to our moderator today. Now, moving on to today's program, I'd like to introduce our moderator for the discussion, Kate Logan. Ms. Logan is Associate Director of Climate at the Asia Society Policy Institute. She's also a fellow with ASPI's Center for China Analysis. Her work focuses on enhancing climate action across Asia, including developing a stronger regional vision for achieving net zero emissions and encouraging more ambitious action in key national jurisdictions, especially China. Previously, Kate worked at the Climate Works Foundation, where she managed grants for the Clean Energy, Clean Air Initiative to rapidly transform the global power sector away from coal power and toward clean energy. You'll be able to read more about Kate in our program found in the chat function in just a few moments. But with that, we're very fortunate to have her with us today. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Kate, now to introduce today's fellow panelists and continue this briefing.
Sounds great, Alec, and thanks so much for the kind introduction. And I'm really pleased and excited for today's session and happy to be here. So hi, everyone, and welcome to today's Southeast Asia in Focus series hosted by the U.S. Asia Institute, as Alec already mentioned. I serve as Associate Director of Climate at the Asia Society Policy Institute, which is a think and do tank that tackles major policy challenges confronting the Asia-Pacific region in three specific areas of security, prosperity, and sustainability. A little bit about my own work. I focus specifically, as Alec mentioned, on climate mitigation and net zero, and also more recently have helped set up the High-Level Policy Commission on Getting Asia Net Zero, which is spearheaded by Asia Society's president and CEO and the former Australian Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, along with other members such as Ban Ki-moon, focused on enhancing national ambition in Asia on net zero, especially in terms of a pathway that enhances economic development and livelihoods along with climate goals. So turning to today's program, to all the congressional staffers and DC professionals calling in today, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate the time you are taking to learn more about Southeast Asia. And as Alec already mentioned, today's briefing will provide a brief overview of key climate change impacts of the region, focusing specifically on food security challenges for Southeast Asia. And during the final 15 minutes or so, the panel will answer questions from the audience. So please do feel free to send those through the chat or the question and answer function at any time. With that, I have the great pleasure of introducing my fellow panelists for today's briefing. And I'm really glad to have two really terrific experts here with us today. First is Brian Eyler, who directs the Southeast Asia program at the Energy, Water, and Sustainability at the Stimson Center. He's an expert on transboundary issues in the Mekong region and specializes in China's economic cooperation with Southeast Asia. He has spent more than 15 years living and working in China, and over the last 2 decades has conducted extensive research with stakeholders in the Mekong region. And also a quick shout out, he published a book, I think in 2019, is that right? Called The Last Days of the Mighty Mekong, which I highly recommend if you have a chance to check it out. In addition to Brian, we have Christian Mann, who is an adjunct fellow in the Global Food Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. Where he also previously served as a research fellow working on projects in East Africa, Southeast Asia, and Central America, and specifically on food security as well. He's also a consultant with Just Rural Transition, which is based at the Meridian Institute and has previously worked with the Catholic Relief Services and the Palladium Group. So I could go on and on about our panelists' accomplishments, but at this point, I'd like to direct you to the link in the chat function that includes their full bios that Alec, I believe, will be posting there. So with that, let's dive into today's session. And I'd like to start with you, Christian, to sort of give us an overview of climate change and its impacts on food security in the global context. And I know that today we'll focus specifically on Southeast Asia, but I think it would be great to start just by giving sort of the high level of what's going on a global level and then diving a bit more deeply into the Southeast Asia region. So over to you, Christian, to start.
Sure, Kate. Thanks for the question, and thanks for having me here. Really nice to be with you all. And Brian, I'm looking forward to learning more about your book. It sounds fascinating. So, I've asked Kate to put a link across the policy brief we did a couple of years ago that helps us think about the overall impacts of climate change on food security. Most of the time when you hear about this topic, you'll hear people talking about predictions of decreases in food production. And there's a lot of different models on this topic. There's a lot of different ways of anticipating the impact of climate change on agricultural production. The most recent ones I've seen predict the level of decrease by about 20%, depending on the degree of adaptation measures that we implement. Now, that number 20% depends on where you are in the world. Some parts of the world and higher latitudes will actually see increases in food security because of increases in temperature. So it's not lost on me that areas where we'll see the highest decrease in agricultural production are in regions across Africa and Southeast Asia, countries that have done quite little to contribute to the climate crisis. So we can talk a lot about agricultural production, as that's sort of one of the main vectors through which climate change will impact food security. But I thought I'd just sort of, while you maybe peruse the policy brief that I've asked Kate to put across in the chat, I just want to give you two quick illustrations that I think, illustrate how complex this issue of climate change and food security is and how it intersects with a variety of other issues in different places. The first illustration comes from El Salvador, actually, where I was working a couple of years ago on a mini documentary series on climate change adaptation. And I was in a rural part of El Salvador, and I was speaking with a farmer who told me that we were standing on the hillside of his farmland, and he was growing sorghum, which of course is a grain. And he told me that, this is his family farm. He's been on this farm for generations. But in recent years, the intensifying floods that he's seen, largely because of climate change, we think, have caused his yields to drop off a cliff, because if rain only comes in intense, in more shorter intense periods, then your crop will either dry up or get washed away. Because of this decrease in yields, people like this farmer and the others in Central America are increasingly migrating out of that region towards the American border. And that dynamic is fueling a lot of it's a large contributor to the so-called border crisis that we're seeing in the United States. So, when I often tell policymakers that something as mundane as soil health actually has a lot to do with national security, and it's those linkages that I think we need to start making more consistently in order to address the climate crisis at its root causes. Let me give one other illustration, Kate, and then I'll go back to you. A couple of years ago, I think 2018, there was a large infestation of locusts in East Africa. You may not have heard about this, but it was the biggest infestation of its kind in decades. And what happens is, as climate change causes an increase in rainfall in certain areas, combined with large-scale changes in global circulation of warm air, that leads to moister deserts. Moister deserts actually become more fertile breeding grounds for locusts. And what we find is that these giant swarms of locusts absolutely decimate crops in countries like Ethiopia. If it's a plant and it's green, locusts will eat it. And the impact on food security, on agricultural livelihoods was very profound. Now, what's interesting about this is that sometimes the solution is worse than the problem. The United Nations responded to this infestation with a large-scale spraying of some sort of insecticide across these regions. I happen to have a friend named John who has an apple farm in Ethiopia. His bee population was killed by the UN's spraying of insecticide that was meant to address the locusts. So it was obviously a good idea. There needed to be an intervention, but you can see how sometimes these unintended consequences that arise from our responses to climate crises can actually be problems in themselves, especially when you're talking about something as sensitive as pollinators, which is so fundamental for food security. So there's a lot more stats I think we'll get into about, sort of dynamics about how climate change is impacting food security, but I hope those illustrations help sort of ground the conversation and what we're talking about. And as Kate says, we'll get into the context of Southeast Asia even more here in a couple of minutes. So Kate, let me stop there and go back to you.
Thanks, Christian. That was really terrific and helpful. And I might add in response to your first point, which is really important just on the links between climate change and security more generally, that the recently released national security strategy does make a lot of these linkages a lot clearer than previously. And I think that's a really important step in the direction in terms of understanding how all the impacts from our changing climate will start to lean into so many other foreign policy and other policy areas. Turning now to Brian and sort of shifting globally to Southeast Asia, was wondering if you could help paint a picture of where Southeast Asia gets its food from in the first place, and specifically the resource base of the Mekong River, and then maybe go into a little bit the impacts of climate change, but just to start by understanding, where the food comes from in the first place in the region.
Sure. Thanks, Kate. Well, instead of starting in Southeast Asia, let's start at Whole Foods on P Street, or any supermarket in Washington, where you're going to find food that's imported from mainland Southeast Asia. And today I'm going to talk mostly about mainland Southeast Asia, but we might get into other parts of Southeast Asia as well. That might be labeled Mekong. Whole Foods sells a Mekong rice that comes from Cambodia. And if you're a fan of H Mart or any of the Asian supermarkets out there, you're going to find aquaculture products like tilapia and shrimp from Thailand and from the Mekong Delta and Vietnam. So the food that is produced in the mainland Southeast Asia, some of it from the Mekong River, is not just consumed there, but it's also a form of export for these countries. So it's an important income earner. Now, that being said, well, before I move to how Southeast Asians consume their food, that income is so important for a country like Vietnam, that Vietnam is a huge net rice exporter. So is Thailand. And in the Mekong Delta, and I'm going to show you a diagram here of the Mekong in a bit, rice production in the Mekong Delta on just 12% of the country's land is responsible for 50% of the country's rice export. So there's kind of an unbalanced distribution or a reliance on Vietnam's income from rice exported from the Mekong Delta to the rest of the world. Now, the thing to know about internal consumption of food is that a lot of food within mainland Southeast Asia is not shared across borders. It's mostly domestically produced. That is with the exception of, say, Cambodian rice, because everybody likes Cambodian rice. The Vietnamese will tell you, sorry, that Cambodian rice tastes better, it looks better, and therefore they prefer buying Vietnamese rice, and it's the Cambodian rice, and it's also one of the reasons why our supermarkets have more Cambodian rice than any of the rice sold at scale here in Washington, and that rice is provided for by the Mekong River system, by the natural floods of the Mekong River in Cambodia. And it's produced at a relatively low cost because those floods deliver nutrients through sediment bases, new water, and flush out toxins that could settle on the land and create infertile land on a seasonal basis. And what climate change is doing to the flood cycle is it's changing the flood cycle. Let's just say it's changing the flood cycle now. And we'll come back to specific changes in a bit. And it's threatening the ability for countries like Cambodia and Vietnam to produce their rice. But by and large, food that is produced within these or consumed within these countries, whether it's Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Myanmar as well, is grown there. So that means there's a lack of regional trade, mostly because of logistics issues, inability for, say, cold storage to reach across borders, different regulations on food export regionally from country to country, and other reasons which prevent kind of regional food trade. So, the average Thai person, not in Bangkok, but outside of Bangkok, they're going to have a small garden in their backyard. And that garden is going to be kind of your pantry garden that will grow simple vegetables like Thai eggplants or basil or peppers. And those are the things that go into making Thai food great, right? And the other cultures tend to have these home gardens as well around Southeast Asia. Protein varies from country to country. I would say Thailand is kind of the best at having a diverse protein mix from its own animal husbandry sectors, as well as from plant-based proteins. But countries that are not as well endowed tend to be more reliant on one source of protein. And Cambodia is a case in point. Cambodia gets most of its animal protein from capture fisheries from the Mekong River in the Mekong Basin. In fact, 80% of its animal protein intake comes from that capture fishery. And that capture fishery is threatened by climate change, as well as what humans are doing to portions of the river system. Again, we'll get into those details here in a bit. Vietnam's got one of the largest populations in Southeast Asia, definitely the densest population of any country in Southeast Asia, with the 12th largest population on the planet, about 100 million people, and not so much land. So protein is a challenge in Vietnam. Vietnam is actually importing a lot of its protein, just like China is. So supply chains from the United States, US meat is very much desired in Vietnam. Are sending that meat there, but they can also be threatened by what's happening in the United States, as threatened by climate change here, as well as disasters on the ocean, which could also affect the transport of food. So that's just a brief run through and some connections to climate change. We're going to take a deeper dive into the Mekong natural resource base here in a bit. I just wanted to set the stage a little bit.
Thanks so much, Brian. That was really, really helpful, and also makes me think of, apart from climate change, just general environmental impacts, remembering back to, I think, in 2016, when there was a major pollution incident in Vietnam with spillage off the coast of hazardous chemicals threatening the fisheries stock really majorly, and just a lot of impacts on economic livelihoods in addition to overall food security issues in the first place. So really looking forward to further insights from you.
Sure.
On the Mekong region. Yeah.
And if I could just add quick, to marine fisheries, all of the countries of the Mekong, with the exception of Laos or mainland Southeast Asia, are huge consumers of marine fisheries. And this tends to send their fleets far offshore into the high seas or into overlapping sea space of the South China Sea and to deplete fish stocks. There is no good regional fish assessment, fish stock assessment for the seas of Southeast Asia. There's a lot of encroachment and IUU fishing, that's illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing there. China catches a lot of heat for its national fleet of fishers and the maritime militia that supports it. But I'll just say that Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, Philippines, they're all aggressors in this. They all have really bad records in illegal fishing, and these fish stocks are depleting very, very quickly.
Thanks for that. And yeah, no, it would be great to turn back to some of the more specific impacts of that in a bit. Now, I do want to turn back to you, Christian, and some of the work that you've done specifically on Southeast Asia on rural and agricultural regions, and was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your research in that area and specifically how climate is impacting on food security from a rural and agricultural perspective in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, sure, Kate, happy to. I'll say a couple of things about Nepal because I think it's an example of a country that's particularly vulnerable to climate change, and it illustrates dynamics that we're seeing in other parts of the region. One major sort of macroeconomic dynamic that's being sort of accelerated by climate change is again rural outmigration. I think something like a third of Nepal's GDP is from remittances, and that's funds that are sent back to Nepal from mostly men that are working in the Emirate states or elsewhere because they simply can't make a living with farming. Now, what happens to family farms when men are gone? You see an increasing feminization of the responsibility for household work, for keeping the kitchen garden that Brian mentioned. You're actually seeing a decrease in biodiversity because there's simply less labor to help keep up farms and gardens. So, if I'm a policymaker, seeing a third of my country's GDP coming from remittances doesn't sound like a long-term strategy for economic development. It's hardly a critique of the Nepali government, but I think this basic question of the economic viability of agriculture in the face of climate change is a really important national security question and economic development question. Another sort of dynamic that's really, really shaping livelihoods and food security in Southeast Asia has to do with the decimation of communities along rivers where you're seeing glacial lake outbursts leading to floodings of these communities. I have to tell you, seeing this with my own eyes, it's tragic because sometimes these floods give communities only a couple of hours or a couple of minutes to react. And what's lost, if not lives, are an entire season's worth of crops. And for people that are living subsistently on the verge of poverty, that itself can be the difference between life and death. A couple of minutes. In a couple of minutes, I want to talk about one solution to this issue of increasing floods that are arising from the melting of glaciers that we saw when we were working with a couple of development organizations in Nepal, and that's actually work that's supported by the U.S. government. There's a couple more things to say, but I think those dynamics of outmigration, feminization of labor, decreases in biodiversity, and then sort of decimation of landscapes because of floods. Those are some of the major dynamics we're seeing in rural areas.
Thanks, Christian. That was helpful in terms of pinpointing some of the different overall high level factors at play. And Brian, turning back to you, wondering if you have any specific examples you'd like to highlight from your own work, and also just want to point to one of the questions in the chat box as well, which might be perhaps in your area of expertise, which is also what impact has US-China competition had, if any, on Southeast Asia food security?
Great. I do want to emphasize that Christian's giving us examples from South Asia. Southeast Asia has no instance of glaciers or glacial lake outburst floods, but sudden floods, unannounced floods, and the need for early warning on floods is definitely a huge priority for Southeast Asia, and only increasing as climate change impacts take hold. I want to go into the Mekong here and show you a few examples. Let me make sure you can see this. We're going to kind of go upstream, looking at the Mekong Delta. We can all see a full screen of the Mekong, of three maps of the Delta here.
Yep.
Here are three examples of how climate change is impacting the Mekong Delta. And you have to remember, this is a major food export zone, as well as a food security guarantor in terms of rice production for the country of Vietnam. We're looking at a patch of land that's roughly the size of West Virginia, but it's populated with many more people. 20 million more people live, 20 million people live in Vietnam's portion of the Mekong Delta. And this is where the Mekong River goes into the South China Sea. What you're seeing there, one is on the top left map, you can see all the crisscrossing of blue lines. Those are canals. The Mekong Delta is populated with 9,000 kilometers of canals that are used to mostly move food and agricultural products and people around the Delta. There are many more canals than roads within the Delta, although roads are now catching up in terms of what the length of kilometers of roads are. And that's actually changing the logistical flows of food as well. But the orange shaded part on that top left map is salinity penetration into the Delta as a result of sea level rise. So as the sea rises, tides push further and further in to this Delta every day. And the gradient of this Delta is only about 2 meters from the coastline up to the border with Cambodia, where the kind of the detail of that map stops. And so this is really a daily effect, if you can imagine. And the higher the tide, the higher the ocean, the more penetration happens. And this salty water prevents food from, like rice, from being produced in a robust manner. So it challenges that rice export and the rice food guarantor for the country of Vietnam. So how are people in Vietnam adjusting? Well, they're shifting to more brackish water-oriented production, from agriculture to aquaculture. Shrimping, particularly, and large-scale shrimping is fit for parts of the Delta where there's a saltier mix of water. And some farmers have reached success with this. But more recently, there's been kind of an overshift to shrimping, and farmers aren't able to gain financing to make this transition anymore because of perceived risks to market risks, as well as system risks to managing fish farms. And it's tough to raise fish farms. You know, shrimp. If a virus or a sudden storm comes, you could lose your entire crop just like that. And many shrimp farmers in the Vietnam Delta have been experiencing this. The bottom bottom left map shows two different representations or predictions of what sea level rise could do to the Mekong Delta, particularly with the effects of storm surge. Now, the Mekong Delta is not, it's not like Southeast Asia's Florida. It's not a susceptible zone for hurricanes and typhoons. The typhoons tend to pass over the larger kind of portion of mainland Southeast Asia's peninsula. Yet storm surge could happen. And you can see most of the Delta could be wiped out by 2050. And the Vietnamese government is really struggling with solutions to this. Part of the solution is learning to live with water and learning to live with floods, adaptable living habitats, as well as adaptable economic livelihoods that can be carried out with water all around. Another part of the solution is actually knocking down many of those canals that I talked about earlier to allow floods to move naturally across the landscape. And you can imagine that this comes with much controversy because you're kind of introducing floods into that landscape. But importantly, the Mekong Delta has always been a natural landscape for floods until humans showed up there and started building all those canals and waterways and determining where water went. And in that engineering of the Mekong Delta has created an over-reliance on freshwater, if you will. And some of that over-reliance is demonstrated on the right map, where we're looking at land sinking because of a lack of freshwater availability, whether it's a lack of freshwater because the wet seasons of the Mekong are not as wet, or it's because the water around them is becoming saltier. Farmers are bringing water up from underground, and that's causing the land to sink as aquifers underground are depleting. The darker the color there are the higher instances of land subsidence or land sinking. And the worst is around 3 centimeters per year. So if you think about sea level rise is 3 millimeters per year. 3 centimeters per year is a magnitude higher, and those two work together to, destroy the integrity and the economic viability of the Mekong Delta. Now, another example I want to look at is the Tonle Sap. So the Tonle Sap is a lake in the middle of Cambodia. It's the world's largest inland fishery. It's extremely diverse. Has 200 different species of fish in them, and those fish tend to migrate in and out of the Tonle Sap Lake. The Tonle Sap Lake is the beating heart of the Mekong, because during the wet season months, which run from June to November of each year, the lake expands 5 times its normal size, and 60 times the amount of water that's in there during the dry season comes in during the wet season. And it's this expansion and contraction over and over again, which brings the fish in, brings the nutrients in, and then sends them back out to the rest of the Mekong, that make the Mekong a mighty food system. 500,000 tons of fish come out of that lake each year for the Cambodian people, providing them, like I said, with 80% of their animal protein intake. And it drives the entire fish productivity of the Mekong Basin, responsible for 2.6 million tons annually. All of our America's, Canada's, and Mexico's, North America's rivers and lakes combined produce only 160,000 tons. So that's 13 times less than what one river system does in Southeast Asia. It truly is a mighty river system. And that pulse, if you will, that heartbeat is being threatened by dams and climate change. So first of all, just to show you how many dams have been built in the Mekong Basin, China's got 129 on its portions of the river, 11 on the mainstream, and many on tributaries. Thailand's got the most. These are all built on tributaries, and these are many different types of dams. Laos is building the most. Laos will build more than 200 in addition to the 100 that it plans to build now. That's already building. Cambodia would also like to dam the Mekong, but Cambodia is kind of paused on building dams given the recognition and a threat to that inland fishery. And just to know what some of the impacts of dams are, what dams do is they hold back water during that monsoon season, that flood season, and they reduce the level of the river downstream, and they reduce the ability of that heart to beat, if you will. And the more dams there are, the greater the reduction is. Additionally, dams also prevent fish from migrating in and out of the lake and throughout the entirety of the Mekong system, and prevent sediments from flowing downstream. And to come back to the delta, the Mekong Delta needs to flood every year in order for sediments to be cast across the land and push the land mass of the delta out into the ocean. The opposite is happening. The sediments aren't being distributed there anymore. And again, like many other things that I mentioned, this weakens the delta. One final point is that the climate of the Mekong is changing. And we have come up with research, and I can go deeper into this later, to show that during the wet seasons that have been particularly dry, 2019, 2020, 2021 have been particularly dry wet season years because of a lack of rain. China's upstream dams and Laos's upstream dams, the big ones, operate in a way that exacerbate those droughts, that exacerbate those wet season droughts. They kind of hold as much water back as they would during any normal year. But when there's less water coming into the system downstream to make the Mekong mighty, what they hold back is proportionally more impactful. And we think that given these new climate signals and new weather patterns happening in mainland Southeast Asia, dams, instead of being part of the problem, need to be part of the solution, so that the countries of the lower Mekong can signal to those that have the dams to release more water during times of need. And that's an opportunity for the United States to be involved in, for a better operation, to demonstrate to the countries of the lower Mekong how to communicate to China, how to communicate to upstream countries on how to better operate the river given these changing conditions. I'll end there. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Brian. That was a really terrific deep dive into the Mekong region, and really, really great overview and visuals as well. I want to bring it back out and make a bit of a shift from looking at the problem to solutions. And I think you hinted to this at the end, and maybe turn back to Christian first on this one. But given all of these risks and issues that we've discussed, what current solutions are being pursued, and specifically by the U.S. government, as well as what are further opportunities for engagement in the region. I know Brian pointed to the role of the dams at the end, but in addition to that, one other question that I'd have as well is we've touched on this issue of trade and how most of the food produced is coming from domestic sources, wondering if trade impacts are also part of this. So I might add that as well, but maybe turn back first to you, Christian, and then back to Brian on this question of solutions.
Yeah, sure. One solution I'd like to sort of talk about has to do with bioengineered fences that are placed into rivers to help increase the deposition of sand and mitigate the impacts of floods. Kind of a technical way to say it, but I'll drop a link to a very short video in the chat that you can watch at some point. This is one of the many documentaries we made on climate change adaptation. But like I was saying, what these fences do, these fences are made of bamboo, and what Mercy Corps, a development partner of the US government, was doing was installing these fences in rivers that are prone to flooding, rivers that have been causing significant erosion. And the fences that are installed in the riverbed cause the flow of water to slow and therefore cause an increase in the deposition of sand. And this actually helps to reverse erosion. In one of the communities we were visiting, there was a couple of farmers who were actually growing sugarcane in one of the areas that had been reclaimed through this very simple technology. So it's a really cool example. There's some nice drone aerial footage in that little video that I encourage you to look at. But the reason I bring this example up is not because it's applicable everywhere, but because this kind of low-tech, nature-based solution, I think, is something that's very scalable. It's not very expensive. It lasts a long time. It's culturally appropriate. So in communities that are particularly vulnerable, we think that this type of intervention, this sort of solution, supporting these through development partners such as Mercy Corps, is a really scalable solution, something that's really practical and can work in a lot of different places. We talk about a couple of other different examples, such as sand dams in Kenya, another different kind of dam than what Brian's talking about. But I encourage you to look at the other videos in that series because I think it illustrates some really exciting interventions that can be used to address climate change.
Thanks, Christian. That's a really interesting example, and like how you pointed out some of the benefits in terms of cost and cultural implications as well. Brian, turning to you from your perspective, what are some of the solutions that you've been looking at in your work and specifically also from a US government perspective? Sure.
And Christian, thanks for noting nature-based solutions as a key to the future. I encourage all of you to dig deeper into this particular topic. It's one of the hot topics in climate resilience, in discourse of climate resilience these days. And thankfully, the Biden administration has embraced it, as well as the agencies of the executive branch. We're hosting a nature-based solutions policy dialogue for the Mekong US Partnership. That is the official US government regional policy framework towards the Mekong region in December in Vietnam's Mekong Delta. This is a grant that Stimson implements for the State Department. And if you want to learn more about that, maybe you want to attend it. I'll drop my email address here. You can get in touch with me through the chat. And one of the solutions of many that we'll be highlighting there are mangroves and planting mangroves on the coastline of coasts that are failing. And mangroves can do lots of things, but importantly, they serve as a buffer and a buttress against sea level rise and the storms that are intensifying and are kind of wrecking the coastlines and causing them to kind of disintegrate into the ocean. And in Cambodia, you'll find examples particularly, and I hate to focus so much on China, but it is a Chinese-driven thing, of Chinese developers, especially economic zones on Cambodia's coastline. You might have been reading about these with scam compounds and casinos in Cambodia in the last couple months or so, where the developers are tearing the mangroves down and extending the land out into the ocean through land reclamation efforts. And that's the exact opposite of what needs to be done, and has huge knock-on effects for fisheries depletion, for habitat and species depletion of animals and fauna that are located in coastal areas. And these things benefit us, and we as humans, there in Cambodia, it's only getting worse. Other investments can be in early warning and forecasting. We can't assume, we have pretty good early warning and forecasting systems here. So when Hurricane Ian hit Florida's coast, the death toll was like 100 people or so. Devastating hurricane, one of the worst that we've ever seen. Yet the death toll was somewhat small. The damage was huge, right? But there's an adaptation. There's an ability for people to get out, right? When disaster hits. The countries of Southeast Asia don't have the capacity to forecast and to prepare and adapt to these changes. And the tools that can be used for this, for detecting and identifying, providing early warning, are becoming cheaper and more accessible every day. And so much so that my team has developed an early warning system via our Mekong Dam Monitor for floods delivered by dams upstream to parts of Thailand and Laos, where we're able to watch the river and reservoirs using satellites and issue early warning 2 to 5 days before a part of the river rises suddenly. And this is saving assets, it could be saving lives. And the government of Thailand particularly sees this as a very useful effort. And that's a small part of our Mekong Dam monitoring work. And our Mekong Dam monitoring work costs about $250,000 a year. So again, the trade-off there is quite effective. Importantly, it can be even cheaper if these mechanisms can be kind of deployed in the region and owned and operated by local people. In the case of the 3 years of very severe wet season drought in the Mekong, that can be forecasted too. It can be forecasted months in advance. And China has the meteorological capacity to do this. Thailand probably does too. But countries like Cambodia don't. Cambodia's got one Doppler radar system for the whole country. So there needs to be an investment in the tools, the hydrometeorological tools, the climatological tools that can forecast for a change in the future, as well as the mechanisms to adapt. And that, in my last comment in the last portion, I mentioned there are ways that dams can be used to release water during the wet season when water is needed, and that would help downstream countries adapt.
Thanks, Brian. And Christian, I see your hand up too on early warning systems or something related to that.
Well, I had a broader comment actually, but Brian, that is super cool what you're talking about. I'm wondering if you could put a little information in the chat about the monitoring system you guys have developed. I really like that. I'm just, I'm cognizant that a lot of our audience here today is on the Hill and working with lawmakers. And I just want to, stress that part of the, at least as I see it, maybe Brian has a different view, but as I see it, climate change is a technical problem, but it's also a political problem. And the problem is that historically we've treated challenges to food security that are linked to climate change or other things as sort of strictly a technical problem. And what that does is it sort of it insulates the intervention from diplomatic efforts, from the politics. And I'm most encouraged by efforts to address food security that are related to climate change when there's both sort of a technical and a political component where diplomacy is at play, but also really strong technical interventions such as the ones that Brian is mentioning and the ones that I've mentioned. So I don't think it's a binary choice. I don't think it's a false dichotomy. And I encourage those of you who are working on the Hill to help the members of Congress you work with think about that as sort of a really good role for the United States to play, both in terms of providing the financial resources to invest in really sound nature-based solutions, for example, but also to be a leader diplomatically in helping countries galvanize political leadership to address these things. We know it's not one or the other, it's absolutely both. Kate, back to you.
That's a really, really important point, Christian. I think plays really well into the next question I wanted to ask, which is sort of around this idea of polycrisis and this moment that the world is in from two different perspectives. One is, what are the knock-on impacts of the additional crises our world is facing, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, the fallout from Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, and all the other energy, food, and price-related impacts from that on some of these challenges that we're discussing in Southeast Asia, specifically halfway around the world from some of the direct conflict that I just mentioned, but obviously global knock-on impacts from that, the debt crisis as well in a number of these countries. How are those sort of interacting with the challenges we've been discussing on one hand, and then, as you mentioned, the other hand, how can the solutions for climate also be solutions for these other crises, and how can and should they be linked, especially in terms of, like you mentioned, Christian, the U.S. government perspective and the role that our audience can play in drawing those linkages with their offices. So maybe start with you again, Christian, and then back to Brian on this.
Yeah, well, you had a bundle of very good questions in there. So
so I tried to wrap it all together. I know we only have a few minutes left, and then I have one more question after this. So
yeah, no, it's good. Maybe bring to the top the one question you'd like me to try to address so I can make sure I'm focusing on a priority.
Yeah, so I guess specifically when you talk about linking the solutions to these crises, what are tangible examples of how to do that in practice? And thinking of, for instance, a lot of the solutions we've been talking about today are adaptation funding. And if the U.S. can put more resources toward adaptation finance based on some of the commitments we've made diplomatically towards some of these countries facing these crises, that has knock-on impacts for political and economic and other situations in these countries. So I guess from your perspective, what's your tangible recommendation in terms of linking some of these solutions together?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, one initiative I'm really sort of bullish about is the United States Agriculture and Innovation Mission for Climate Initiative, AIM4C. I can put a link to that in a chat in a moment. But what this initiative is trying to do is use the climate COPs, such as the one in Sharm el-Sheikh that's beginning next week, to galvanize really political leadership for countries to invest in their agriculture sectors. Now, if you don't work in the agriculture sphere, I know what you're thinking. That sounds very mundane, but the fact is that investments in ag R&D are a very good investment. Some people think the ROI is up to 10x. Those take a while to vest. This is what people call slow magic, ag R&D. But what's cool about ag R&D is that innovations that come out of this sort of investment, in the 1970s, the Green Revolution led to innovations that we think saved up to a billion lives. Now, there were a lot of problems with the Green Revolution, and I'm not suggesting otherwise. It's complicated, that legacy. But these sorts of innovations that the US's Ag Innovation Mission for Climate are trying to galvanize, I think, are really important. It remains to be seen, and we have to earn that. We have to help countries find the money to invest in their ag sectors, and that's not easy because a lot of countries are resource constrained already. But I think using the climate COP processes to help countries bring forward positive examples of what they're doing and opening a political space for experimentation is extremely important, especially in countries where politicians and decision makers are risk averse and where the sort of opportunity costs are really high because of constrained budgets. So I'll put a little bit more information in the chat about AIM4C, but I think that's just one example of something I'm particularly excited about.
Thanks, Christian. No, I think that's a really good example. I just popped the link in the chat box to help you out. But if you have anything to add, go ahead. And yeah, no, I think also just in terms of one of the other aspects of this is linking mitigation and adaptation efforts as well. Mitigation being reducing emissions and adaptation being, essentially reacting and buttressing ourselves against the impacts that we're discussing today. And those solutions can and should be linked together in some of these areas. Brian, turning to you on this question.
Yeah, just to riff off Christian's comments. One thing that the U.S. is often criticized as it lacks to Southeast Asia is people-to-people connections. Our universities, research universities, I can think of so many: Penn State, Maryland, Indiana, Arizona State, UC Irvine, UW. I mean, they've all got these amazing agricultural transition-focused research programs that help farmers around them transition to smarter agriculture. Some of them, a few of them, are at work in the Mekong. We can always do more to promote this, and Congress can, holding the purse strings of our foreign policy, can do more in this space to increase these people-to-people or institutional exchanges. And there's just no shortage of needs for good and best practices in countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, and Laos. A COVID-19 example, pivoting to one other example, and then we'll get to questions, I hope, is that coming back to Cambodia, a lot of its population actually works in other countries, particularly Thailand. And when borders closed, those migrant workers in Thailand who are Cambodian had to go home. So many of them lived around the Tonle Sap Lake. So the Tonle Sap Lake is a population of like 2.5 million people living around its coast and shorelines. And that number was significantly increased. No one knows exactly how many with the lockdowns. And that only caused a greater kind of resource crisis in and around the lake for fish consumption as these wet season droughts were really taking hold and depleting the fishery. And as a response, this year, for the first time, the Cambodian government issued a closed season for everyone for fishing. So a big fishing ban on the lake for 5 months during the time when people typically fish. And one of the other things that they did was the government banned floating villages or floating homes. And a lot of people and fishers on the lake, they just live out on the lake on these floating homes, and that's their livelihood. And they moved these floating homes to the coastline. And for some reason, they had forgotten that the lake typically floods, okay? Because it hadn't flooded in 4 years. And lo and behold, this year it flooded. And many of those floating homes that were relocated to the lakeside on kind of stilts were flooded. The agricultural minister there lost his job just last week. And a new one was replaced because of that particular issue, because of mishandling that issue. We can point to a lot of reasons why that happened, but the pandemic only introduces level of complexity for policy decisions. And if more data, higher capacity were built within this decision-making space, I think outcomes could have been very different there.
Thanks, Brian. That's a really good example. Turning to audience questions, we do have one question in the chat box that I see essentially about climate impacts and migration, and if we're seeing migration-related changes or projected changes as a result of some of the climate-related impacts that we're discussing. So feel free to respond to that. I'm going to add a second question of my own, just separate on top of that, and just sort of layer a few questions here. Which is we're entering this moment in 2022 where there are a number of upcoming summits, and specifically the G20 is being hosted by Indonesia and Southeast Asia, focusing on green recovery as well as energy transition. Also a number of other key summits this time of year, in addition to COP27, but regional summits as well. And wondering if you have any specific expectations for solutions coming out of those summits as well. So 2 different questions. Feel free to respond to one or both, and maybe start with you, Brian, and then turn to Christian.
Great. Yeah, I'll give a quick answer to the migration question, climate migration question, with rivers drying up as a result of climate effects, weather effects, and dams. I'm not a proponent of the discourse of water wars in mainland Southeast Asia and in the Mekong. That these might happen in other parts of the globe where countries compete over scarce water resources, but there's a spirit of cooperation that exists, for better or for worse, within the Mekong that I think open conflict won't break out. But what will happen is a kind of a rapid deterioration of food security or food systems, particularly around the Tonle Sap Lake. I think the Tonle Sap Lake is the place to watch for crises to break out. And when that food cannot be provided, people are going to move. And we also think non-state actors, like criminal elements, of which Cambodia has many, given the governance challenges there, will begin to provide for those people in need and utilize them for potentially nefarious purposes. So a whole bunch of bad things can happen through this food security crisis that could erupt in the Mekong. Some of those migrants could go to Thailand or to Vietnam, becoming, kind of a constraint on the ability for those countries to take care of their own people, let alone these new climate refugees coming in. And maybe you don't buy into this discourse, but we see a lot of it in the United States of new people coming to the United States, and then nationalists or folks who are against that particular form of people movement, banging the political drum of nationalism, and winning in political races and driving political discourse with that particular anti-migration discourse. And it doesn't do anyone much good. So we can see that playing out in, say, Thailand and Vietnam as these climate crises are exacerbated.
Thanks, Brian. I know we're coming up on the hour, so maybe turn to you, Christian, on anything from your perspective to add to that, and then any final last words to emphasize, and then we'll wrap up from there.
Yeah, I was speaking with a individual yesterday who leads a major farmers organization in an East African country. He's a fairly influential person in those circles, and he referred to the climate COPs as being all hat and no cattle. And I think that's for someone coming from the developing world, I think that's a fair critique. There has been an awful lot of talk and not as much action as any of us would like to see. So, my personal feeling is that I'm quite bullish about the ability of these summits to deliver action. And yet, if we don't start doing that very soon, I think public sentiment is going to simply turn against these global summits and the ability of them to galvanize, catalyze action. So I think COP27, COP28, for example, you mentioned the G20, Kate. These are all really important. These next couple of years in particular are just very important in terms of setting up a sequence of events that are linked to climate action. So I'm nervous, but I'm optimistic, I would say. I'm not sure how Brian wants to speak to that question, but there's simply no more time for treating these events as talk shops, and really must turn to action.
Thanks, Christian. Brian, any 30-second final remarks from your end, and then we'll wrap up.
I just think there's so much we can do, even outside of the climate summits. I mentioned the availability of open source platforms and open source data to drive change, particularly in the developing world. With our success of the Mekong Dam Monitor, we're fielding inquiries on flood monitoring and early warning in Indonesia and Malaysia. We're looking at ways to do this type of forecasting in Nepal for cascading Himalayan debris flows and disasters that could be exacerbated by climate change, looking at Pakistan's floods, and looking at the Nile in Egypt. So I think we're on the cusp of kind of a new era in the cheap or the low cost and effective delivery of new systems that can help us adapt to climate change. It's just a matter of getting them in the right hands quickly enough so that there's time to adapt. I'll end there.
Thanks so much, Brian. And thank you to Christian and Brian both for joining today. We'll turn back to Alec, but I think I'm definitely leaving on a hopeful and optimistic note with some of the solutions that you mentioned, not just the early warning systems, but also things like nature-based solutions, the mangrove restoration that you mentioned, a lot of different ideas on the table. So really appreciate your time, and back to you, Alec.
Thank you, Kate. Definitely an optimistic note that we ended on. And I definitely learned a couple things along the way. So thank you all. Kate, again, thank you. We really appreciate you stepping in to moderate, giving both your perspective and guiding the conversation was impressive and great to listen to. And to Brian and Christian, thank you both for everything that you delivered today and all your remarks and insight. I'm sure that a lot of people gained some good amounts of knowledge to take back with them as they go back to work for their offices. So I'm excited to see what we might get in the future with, everything that you said. With the additions of everything that you put in the chat, thinking through this, though we're out of time, we present the opportunity for those who are tuning in to, reach back out to us to see if we can connect further. So if you have any interest in connecting with our speakers again, or getting some of those links back that you had put in the chat earlier, please reach out to us at USAI at usaginstitute.org. We're happy to assist in fostering further that dialogue that we had today, and giving the resource to people that they actually needed. We're working on these issues outside of the panels today. So with that, I'm going to say thank you again. I hope everyone has a good rest of their day. So take care, everybody, and thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.